we'll start off the way we usually do, which is to dig into a little bit of the history and some of the different kinds of information we can pull out of the book that we read for this month, which was Women of the Dawn by Bunny McBride. And then, Carolyn, I'm obviously especially glad that you're here so we can share a little bit. Carolyn and I both have, actually, and Lisa does too, extensive experience with the Abbey Museum in Bar Harbor, and all three of us have worked or continue to work with Wabanaki communities. So we may have some different kinds of insights or information to bring forward in this conversation than we might have otherwise in a book club. So that'll be really fun to be able to do. So I'm going to share my screen and dig in a little bit to Women of the Dawn by Bunny McBride. And so did everybody finish the book or read at least a portion of it?
Yeah.
Yes.
I
Yes.
did not finish at all. Yeah.
Okay, you haven't had a chance to finish yet? Okay.
No, not. Yeah, I just read a little bit so far.
Okay. Well, so it follows the lives of four primarily Penobscot women, one Wabanaki woman, that are through various eras in post-contact Maine. So after European contact comes into the picture, these women have historically significant and interesting lives, although to some degree are rather hard to trace because historically women's lives were not captured or focused on to the same degree that the men in their contemporaries were. So this book is composed in sort of an interesting way. The author, Bunny McBride, calls it, what did she call it? Like storied nonfiction or something along those lines, where she's acknowledging that this is not strictly a nonfiction book, that she really takes some extensive liberties in personifying the women that she's capturing in this story. And at the end, she sort of goes through a justification for how and why she was able to do that. But it's told through the eyes of one narrator whom McBride didn't know personally, but had a chance to meet her daughter and has done a lot of work with her diaries. And so kind of has a sense of Molly Dellis's voice. And so she uses that voice to look back in time as sort of an anchor to a woman who feels adrift in the changing cultural demands of a Native woman in the 20th century. So here's Molly. On our right, she was well known as an actress and a dancer in her time in the 20s, and she's also our narrator. And she hails from Indian Island before there was a bridge. So the postcard on the left shows what the ferry terminal or ferry dock would have looked like to be able to bridge the very short distance between the mainland in Old Town, Maine, and then the Indian Island, which is just one of many islands that encompass the Penobscot Reservation today. But this is the main hub. I'm sorry, my cat is literally climbing up the back of the TV. Okay, so I think she's done. So this encompasses the political seat for the Penobscot Nation, in addition to the cultural hub, and then they inhabit the islands north of the river. And so this island actually ends up playing a role in several of the Molly's lives over time as we look back through the narration of Molly Dellis. So I thought it might be interesting, even though Molly Dellis is covered in the last chapter of the book, her life was really fascinating, and it's the one that we have the opportunity to learn the most about. And because she recorded her own thoughts and her own feelings in a way that was contemporary, and that she had control over that voice in a way that the other Mollys did not. And I feel like it was really difficult to explore deeper and put into context the other three Mollys than what Bunny was already able to do. So this is going to talk a little bit about Molly Dellis, but then I also wanted to take an opportunity to talk a little bit about pre-contact Wabanaki life. There are quite a number of mistakes in this book that were not mistakes at the time, but new research and archaeology and work with tribal communities has changed the picture of what we understand for life to be for Wabanaki people prior to and just at the time of European contact. So we'll dig into that a little bit as well. So Molly Alice Nelson was born in 1903 in November. She was the oldest of 8 siblings, and she was named Molly Dellis, pronounced that way, and then shortened just to Molly. Her mother was a Maliseet woman who was one of the best basket makers of her day, and that really helped sustain their livelihood for a long period of time. Her dad, even though he was educated and ended up attending Dartmouth College for a time, didn't have real steady work. To live on Indian Islands and to be able to maintain cultural ties, it was pretty difficult to find really meaningful, steady work. He served as governor for the tribe for a little while and also as a state representative for the Penobscot Nation to the state of Maine. But he also collected ash, harvested ash, and did odd jobs, and just traveled a little bit for odd different types of work, which left their family reliant on some of the children to help bring in additional income. And so as a girl, Molly was raised in this culture and on the island, and she showed interest in tribal traditions, where she would ask adults to really look back into the oral histories that they were raised in the 1800s and even earlier, and teach her about the oral legends and histories, to talk about their ancestors, their relationship to the land, medicines, different uses for natural plants, and then also songs and dances, which she would be able to pick up and use all of her adult life. She would do odd jobs and chores in exchange for being told stories by her elders. She had a particular relationship with a gentleman named Hemlock Joe, who is featured in the book for a little bit, who is a kind of a lonely elder who she spent a great deal of time with, and also was an informant for an anthropologist who was important later in her life named Frank Speck. So she's on the island, she's collecting stories and songs and dance, and she's taking that and she's incorporating that in an artistic way to start her first public performances when she was a young girl on the island. And then just off the island in Old Town, she would be able to go off the island and perform for local contests and for money from tourists and people who were on the street. And by the time she was a teenager, she was earning dimes dancing for tourists. When she was 15, she decided to leave home to be able to try to earn more money for her family, and she joined a vaudeville act, which was really popular. They said that there were up to like 2 vaudeville acts a week that people would attend, traveling all over the place. So these were a really popular form of entertainment. And there was a lot of cultural misrepresentation and abuse that took place in vaudeville shows, but also the opportunity to travel and be employed in a slightly meaningful way, sort of related to your culture. And so she joined one of these shows and traveled under the name of Princess Ni Bourbon, which was Penobscot in her language for the Northern Lights. She felt torn for her love of home and her community, but also her curiosity about the larger world. And she kept really extensive diaries for her whole life. After being on tour for a number of years, she ended up in a company of indigenous dancers that was dancing in 1924 in Philadelphia, where she met Frank Speck again after he had been on the reservation for a number of years. He was the author of a really important anthropology book called Penobscot Man. And she left the tour to stay in Philadelphia, to remain at the University of Philadelphia and take classes. So she was only able to go through 3 semesters of classes. She danced and performed at the school. She lectured, and that helped earn money for her to be able to take courses. She learned anthropological techniques for research and documentation from Speck and from other professors. And she was able to apply all of those things to be able to talk about Penobscot culture in a meaningful way in Philadelphia. And so she really enjoyed that time, but she couldn't afford to keep up that, both the work and the studies. And so she actually ended up leaving the University of Pennsylvania to join her sister in a Wild West show that was founded in Oklahoma, where she worked as a waitress. She danced, and she also learned to perform on horseback, which I didn't include any pictures of her on horseback, but there's quite a number of her dancing and being quite acrobatic and athletic on horseback. which would certainly not have been true for her Penobscot cultural dances. This was absolutely sort of a Wild West persona that she ends up taking on as part of the showmanship that she was known for. And that was expected by white audiences at the time. So when that run ended, she went back to New York City and she started performing in nightclubs. And so here there's like a little bit of mixed history about what that was like and what it meant for her. According to sort of like the official tribal history of Molly, this was a time when she really felt like her free spirit was able to be unleashed, and she was dancing sometimes at multiple clubs a night, moving from place to place, making her own songs and dances and costumes. But by other accounts, she also felt very taken advantage of. She was quite stunning. And so there's not specifics about abuse, but all vaudeville dancers and club dancers at the time suffered some degree of sort of I can't think of the right word I want, but like they were the possessions of the company that they worked for. And so they were put into these different various positions that maybe weren't always the most comfortable for them. But she performed voluntarily, obviously, at all these clubs and was really starting to make a name for herself as a very well-known dancer with an incredibly sassy personality and a really like great interaction between her audiences and herself. And that brought her to the attention of screenwriter Douglas Burden, who had himself worked quite extensively with Native communities among the Ojibwa. And he wanted to make a silent movie called The Silent Enemy, which was released in 1930. And he cast her in the starring role. So you can actually see her in the still frame on the left inside of what's probably a skin hut as someone else is making their winter count on the right. They spent a year in this location in rural, I think it was in Wisconsin, filming on this set. And so she was a really big part of that cast. They had an all Native American cast. And so it was very rare for that time that it was not only cast Native people in all of the roles, but actually was using Indigenous knowledge and culture to be able to share this story of a tribe's community as they fight against sort of the perils of winter prior to European contact. So the show was very well done and received really, really strong reviews. But because it was released right as talkies were starting to get more popular and films with sound were the expectation, it ended up flopping. And so it didn't have sort of the impact that I think everyone on the film had hoped it would have, but she actually still earned quite a bit of money from being able to act and lead in the role. And it enabled her to buy a house for her family on Indian Island and to be able to settle in that spot later in her life. Because of this experience on the films, she found other bit parts and small parts, but it just really did not fulfill that ambition that she had to go forth and promote Penobscot culture. So we next see her when she has an opportunity to go to Paris, and that's in 1931. She's performing at the International Colonial Exhibition, and she was surprised by the differences between North American audiences and European audiences. North Americans had very set opinions of what they expected an Indian performer to do and to say and to look like. They wanted Plains Indians, warriors on horseback with feathered bonnets and wearing very little clothing. And that was not reflective of Penobscot culture. And so to her pleasant surprise, she did not have to fulfill all of these stereotypes that were expected of her when she was dancing in Europe. And so she danced for royalty, and she danced all over the country for several years, all over the continent for several years, and found that she could incorporate more and more authentic Penobscot dress, music, and traditions. So while she was in Paris, she was also writing for an American newspaper back in Maine as a correspondent. So she's sort of both looking at and observing and thinking about what's happening in Europe at the time, while she's also traveling around as a cultural sort of ambassador or envoy representing Penobscot culture. So the rest of the band that she traveled with did not stay in Europe. They decided to come home, and Molly decided to stay. And she says, maybe I'm foolish with no money, but hopes galore. But I do want to do something with my Indian dancing here in a serious artistic way. And I'm willing to take a great chance to accomplish it. So as I said, she was really renowned as a remarkable dancer. And so she starts to get more and more critical acclaim and notice for her skill. And it's while she's touring that a journalist takes note of her and asks for an interview, and they fall in love. So Jean Archambault introduces her to this whole different life in Paris, where she's able to start mingling with artists and intellectuals. She's back on the lecture circuit like she did when she was in Philadelphia, talking about the culture of Penobscot people and the history. And she's going to museums and all different places with Jean. She's there up until 1939, and she had been writing all this time about these traditional stories that she had heard growing up. There weren't Native people writing those stories down. There are a few examples of anthropologists writing down Native stories from an outsider's perspective, but not from within the culture itself. And so she had wanted to capture these things into a single book, but was never able to publish that in the United States. And in 1931 or 39, the publishing house Paul Gunther gave her an opportunity to publish her collection of Penobscot folktales. But in that September, right as the promotional materials were set to circulate, the Nazi invasion of Poland began and threw France into war. And the book deal never ended up coming through. So as I said, she was this really prolific writer, and she kept extensive diaries for her whole life that give rare insight into her voice and her experiences, and also her opinions about the things that were being sort of inflicted upon her as an ambassador or a representative of Native people in the 20th century. But she also worked as this journalist, sharing her experiences in Portland, Maine. So she ends up she has a baby with Jean, and they end up getting married. She comes back to the United States to have the baby, and they live here for 4 years, but Jean is not granted a visa to come back with her, because probably his political leanings and his writings in the paper caused him to be a risk factor. And there's also thoughts that he might have actually worked for the French government, spying on other nations' navies. And so the United States didn't want him here. So she came back and had the baby, lived here for 4 years, and then didn't want to be separated from him anymore. She was really moved by the story of Saint Castin, the Baron of Saint Castin, and Molly Mathilde. And she didn't want that same story to be repeated in her life, where she's separated by her French husband overseas, and he dies while he's away from her. So she and Jean return to France, and they are living in Paris for a period of time. And when France is right before the French occupation, they decide they're going to move south, closer to Pau, where the Baron of Saint Castin was. And that's where Jean's family was from. And so they move in with his family, and he's working as a scout leader and for the Red Cross. But as the war starts to intensify, they try to get out. And again, the American government won't grant a visa for Jean. And as the Nazis continue to invade France, she flees with Jean, walking, or not with Jean, sorry, he stays with their daughter, Jean. They flee on foot, and they walk all the way from southern France across the Pyrenees and into Spain, where they catch a ride to Portugal to catch a ship back to America. And Jean is stuck in France. And so they write for a couple of years, being able to keep in touch probably for about 1 year. And then she finds out that he ends up dying in one of the refugee camps where he was helping to care for other people fleeing the effects of war. And she goes into a really severe depression, and she ends up spending a year in a mental hospital because she just can't handle the losses of her life. And so she needs help and support. And so her mother checks her into a mental hospital in Bangor, where she spends that year. And she writes a lot during that time while she's in the mental hospital, both observations of the people in the hospital and of the doctors and the nurses and her treatments, but also reflecting on the lives of her ancestors. And she starts to think about and dig into these other Mollys that she's known of from oral history. And so she begins to really start to try to make more significant contributions to Penobscot research. And she leaves the mental hospital and spends her time sort of part-time still on Indian Island, but she ends up going to New York a couple times to try to make a living. But she's never back out into the public eye as a dancer to the degree that she was before. As she's getting older and she's tired and she's got all of this sort of mental health sadness and depression wearing on her. When she was in New York, she tried to model and to do acting jobs, but ended up working in a post office for a number of years, and fell in love with a man who ended up being married and had another family, and that devastated her. And so her daughter ends up actually sort of calling her home to Indian Island, where she ends up spending the rest of her life collecting stories, writing, and then also making traditional dolls, which are in several museum collections. So her book actually ends up being published, which I'll say in a minute. She dies in 1977 from a fall at the top of the stairs when she was 73. So Bunny McBride writes in another format that she played a dual role. Molly Spotted Elk, Penobscot in Paris, was published in 1995, which is a much deeper exploration into her life. And in there, Bunny says she was on exhibition with other colonized people, yet she was also an observer who chronicled the events of the war for a major newspaper back home. Her long-delayed collection of Penobscot legends was finally published in 2009 after she had died by the University of Maine, called Katahdin Wigwam's Tales of the Wabanaki Tribe, is included with French and English translations. So at the time when she was starting to collect these stories, and before most of them were passed down orally for a white historian or an anthropologist to write. So her book and her work is a rare example of Indigenous documentation of their own stories at the time. And so John Bear Mitchell, a Penobscot storyteller and educator, says there's a real difference in the voice, and there's a real difference in certain emphasis that she puts on certain aspects of the story. To hear them in her words is to hear them in her elders' words. So from there, I'm going to move on from our narrator of the story, Molly Dellis, to put a little bit more context and history around specifically MDI, but also the pre-contact and early contact life periods of Wabanaki people. So as I mentioned, the book was written in the 1990s, and some of the archaeological information in it is certainly outdated and has since changed as a result of additional research, both by Maine tribes, but predominantly in partnership between Maine tribes and archaeologists working within the field. So those combination of different ways of looking at the world and life ways have really helped to inform both including oral story and oral tradition and the archaeological record to be able to get a more full picture of what life would have been like for Wabanaki people here prior to European contact. So the main theme in Bunny's book is portaging, moving from one place to another as you sort of transform your thoughts or the way that you move through the world. And I just think that this watershed map of Maine is a really telling way to understand why the concept of portaging is so vitally important to Wabanaki people, and why travel is so predominated by water. And that's because so is Maine and most of the region. So this is like, I would argue that if you ever try to go east and west in Maine, you can't get there from here. The saying is really, really relevant because our roads have to cross through all of this. And this seems like in a lot of ways a much more reasonable way to travel than with the roads we try to crisscross through. So portaging is this really important theme, both that would have been in the lives of Wabanaki people, but certainly is in the role of the book. So we know that initially Wabanaki people would have moved into Maine as soon as the glaciers cleared out about 13,500 years ago. And the land is sort of rebounding from the weight of the glaciers. So as it's doing its rebound, the landscape, especially along the coast, changes quite a bit from what we understand historically. And we know that initially Wabanaki people would have had dugout canoes. So they would have used large trees cut down and the bark taken off, and then they would have burned slow burns into the trunk of the tree and then chipped out the charcoal and the ash inside to be able to create a dugout canoe. But dugouts are really, really heavy and they're difficult to portage and they get waterlogged really quickly. And so it's not an ideal craft if you really want to be moving. So some incredible technological advancement happened about 13,500 or 4,000 years ago with the invention of the birch bark canoe. And it transformed everything in the East, anywhere where there was birch bark that was available. These were incredibly lightweight. They're versatile. They're waterproof. They're rot proof. They are easy to go. You can travel both directions in a birch bark canoe without having to get around and turn it around. And they are really, really, they sit very lightly on the water, which is actually in Wabanaki what birch bark canoe translates to, is sits lightly on the water. So you can see on the left the interior of a birch bark canoe, which is made out of cedar. And so the cedar splits naturally very easy along its grains, along the growth rings of the tree. And so it makes really easily steamed, bent, and manipulated ribs and stays and other material for the interior of the canoe. And then the bark is one piece of bark that is taken from one tree that has to be just right. And the outside of the canoe is the inside of the bark. And so that is the waterproof or water resistant portion of the tree, is that interior of the bark. It's also rot resistant and insect resistant. And then the cedar and the bark are sewn together with the roots of a spruce tree that you can see are the stitchings along the gunnels of the canoe. And then the seams are sealed with a mix of pine, pitch, and bear fat. It takes about 500 hours to build a canoe from harvesting the materials to completion. So it's quite an arduous task. The other thing about the canoes is that they expand and contract at different rates because of all these different materials in them. So once the weather gets cold, you actually can't have them outside. So Wabanaki people would have loaded them with rocks and sank them underneath the water for the winter. The ice would freeze over the canoe. In the spring, when the ice would thaw, they would pull out the rocks, float the canoe, and because it's waterproof and rot resistant, the canoe would be in good shape for continued use. So these were incredibly, vitally important material culture for Wabanaki people, and it allowed them to travel all over the eastern seaboard and extend their trade networks and their relations with other nations extensively, far beyond what would have been possible in a dugout canoe. So we know from historic accounts, Wabanaki people were traveling in birch bark canoes far, far, far from land into the sea, way past where you would be able to see any islands or any land. There's a story of an early ship that was traveling probably from Nova Scotia to Gloucester. It's way out to sea, and they're hailed by Wabanaki people in a birch bark canoe. The ship, probably not irrationally, thinks that they need help. They go out and they don't need help. They need dry matches because their matches had gotten wet for their pipes. And so give them the matches and they go on. And they were quite shocked by that. We have another story of a Wabanaki person who was really upset with the state of Maine and the management of Wabanaki political issues, and asked for where he could get resolution, and was told that he needed to go to Washington, D.C., where the president was. So he paddled his canoe to Washington, D.C. So this network was incredibly extensive, and it really exploded resources for trade. So copper coming in from further to the west, corn, beans, squash coming in from further to the southwest. We know we have quahog clam coming up the coast. So all of these things, these archaeological evidence of this expanding trade network, really, we think is tied very closely to this invention of the birch bark canoe. But canoes were not the only thing that was vitally important for the use of birch bark. Wigwams were also made from bark, and these feature quite a bit in the first three Mollies. They talk a lot about the fact that they were living in birch bark wigwams, either next to settlements, or when they would go out for hunting or traveling, or when they were trying to flee some of the pressures and stresses of war that were happening within the region. These are also very flexible, easy to make, easy to find the resources, easy to put up. And so we know that there were sort of two different styles in the region, the dome shape on the right and the conical shape on the left. Both were used here for various reasons at various times from different types of people. And then the material culture that they talk a lot about in the book related to Wabanaki people. Again, birch bark features really importantly beyond just canoes and wigwams, but into baskets, because of that nature of the bark being waterproof and rot resistant and insect repellent. It's great for food storage. And so you have a couple examples, especially down here closest to the bottom left, of this really beautiful conical sort of triangle container that's quite old in the collections of the Abbey, that would have been used to store berries or other kinds of dried foods. And then that tradition is taken and made into something that is beautiful and appealing to sell. So all of the women talk about the importance of selling material culture to be able to survive both their cultural identity, but also with the transitions to these new societies. And so the example of the birch bark log holder up at the top with the little handle on it has etchings designed into the bark. Bark grows two layers, a winter bark and a summer bark layer. The summer bark is light. So if you harvest it in the winter where the bark is dark, you can etch away to reveal the lighter summer bark underneath. So that was a really popular tool used to decorate birch bark to appeal to Europeans. So for log holders, the sewing baskets are made out of ash, and this is Hong Kong cord, but also traditionally sweetgrass here to the left. Those would also be made to sell dyed brilliant colors, and specifically made to appeal to Europeans. So initially for like work baskets, pack baskets, fish scale baskets for canneries, but then it later becomes more of an art form sold to women. So we have sewing baskets, laundry baskets, waste baskets, scissor kits, wall hangings, like you name it, they made a basket out of it. And so these were really important and versatile. And so you can see in the upper left, the sewing flat, and then the larger one next to it are more utilitarian, whereas we have now a more modern influence of baskets where you have a lot of curls and decoration and maybe sort of more impractical forms where these are actually designed to be art, not like artistic utilitarian, which would have been the crossover between the first types. They also talk about using porcupine quills and moose hair to embroider, so both within clothing, but also in baskets. So the basket in the upper right is an example of a Micmac style of basket using porcupine quills to be able to press into birch bark, which contracts around where you press the hole in and allows you to make these really tight, beautiful quill work designs. But the same is done with moose hair, which also can be used on clothing. And then they do talk a bit about the clothing. So we have two examples of the types of clothing that would have been worn for the first three Mollies. That red trade cloth that is very vivid in a lot of the descriptions here in this piece with the peaked cap. And the combination of both traditional Wabanaki features and European features, also features that they're finding from because a lot of the Europeans they're exposed to are soldiers. So you'll see a lot of that militaristic uniform styles come through in this dress from the period, the sashes and the stockings and the coats and the broad coats and that kind of stuff are all bearing these different influences from multiple cultures. And then a little bit earlier here to the right of the red outfit, we've got examples of a combination of the peaked cap, which would have been traditional here, some birch bark, some trade cloth, some material dress, but also leather moccasins and leggings. So it's just this mix of different materials that you can find and that they're piecing together to be able to create the material culture that's described in the book. And then we have examples of, oh, these are sort of pixelated, sorry. Other examples of material culture. We know obviously that hunting was an important aspect to life here, both on the island and throughout Maine. And the real difference comes into play sort of in this slide about what was shared in the book versus what is the more new archaeological information. And that is the seasonal relationship to place. It was thought even up into the 1990s, apparently, that Wabanaki people came to the coast in the summer and they went inland in the winter. And that was true historically, but it is not true pre-contact. So prior to European contact, the relationship with the land was very fluid. They were not nomadic. They were not moving at random. They had deep connections to a sense of place and understood the resources that were available in all of their traditional territories. However, they knew to go to those places at the time when it was optimal to be there. And so if you think about the Maine winter, it's not always optimal to be in the interior of Maine. It can be very cold, it can be very snowy, very, very deep snow. And even though they have snowshoes and toboggans and sleds, it's still not easy to get around. And it's very difficult to hunt, or it could be hard to find water even reliably. But if you come out to the coast, it's much more mild. You can find always access to shellfish. Every time the tide is low, you can always find reliable access to fresh water as it's coming out into the sea. And so it could be a much more mild place to spend portions of the winter. And the change that's happened in the archaeological record is twofold. As I mentioned, one, it's related to oral histories. So we know from the oral histories of Wabanaki people that a lot of their stories were maps of the landscape. And so they talk about different activities that happen as a way to give you a map, a verbal map of where you're going to go. And so they have the story of the hunter who's after the moose. And so he goes and he lands on this rock and he embeds the snowshoes into the rock. Okay, so there's a winter scene, but it's taking place at Bagaduce on the coast. And because they know the rock has quartz crystals that crisscross in there, like the webbing of snowshoes. So if you come to that rock, you know that you're where the hunter landed. And so what happens next in the story is the hunter kills the moose and he takes out the intestines and he throws the liver to his dog. And so if you look, the rock over here is red, like the dog's liver or the moose's liver. And so you know that's where you go next, because that's where an important portage is to be able to make it safely across this landscape. And so those stories are finally being honored by white anthropologists and understood in a more holistic understanding of Wabanaki people. And it's one of the things that makes doing ethnography in Maine and New England kind of unique, because Wabanaki people don't have a removal story, while their story still is devastating, related to genocide and to the impacts of colonialism. They were never removed from their home territory. And so their oral history is still relevant to their day-to-day lives. And that is really meaningful and important, because that's not true for tribes who are removed. It's very hard to continue your oral traditions if you're not in the spaces where they're relevant. And so that continuation has been really meaningful. The other piece is more scientific, and that is clamshells grow hinges, like on the hinges of the clamshells, they grow 2 different growth rings a year, like a tree, one in the summer and one in the winter. And depending on when they're harvested, if they were killed in the winter, it will look one way. If they're killed in the summer, it will look a different way. So now archaeologists gather the hinges of clamshells to determine when they were harvested. And quite a number of them on MDI were harvested in the winter. So we know that there were Wabanaki people here in the winter to be able to harvest those clams. Other organic resources like different kinds of bones from different migratory creatures also give us a clue as to the types of seasons when people were here on the island. So they would have all sorts of different tools that they would take with them Chert is almost like an obsidian, like a volcanic glass, but a little, very, very fine grained. There are certain flows of chert. Up by Katahdin, there's a flow, and in a couple other places, there are oral stories that direct Wabanaki people to find these cherts, but they're also traded in from other locations. So those would be used for very, very fine bird points all the way to larger axes or cutting tools. But fishing was really, really important. So harpoons and different types of spears for fishing, fishing nets, net weights. These are all things that are found that were really, really important for Wabanaki people in the archaeological record. And then even though this is a community that is moving quite a bit, they also, towards maybe about 3,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago, started developing pottery. So pottery is much harder to move. It's heavy and it breaks really easily. And so it's not as important of a resource for Wabanaki people, but as they were able to extend trade networks and be able to have more reliable resources for extended food networks, pottery played a more significant role because they were not maybe moving around quite as much as they were in certain areas. We know that they did have some systems for land management. We know that they were burning portions of land to keep areas open for deer and other wildlife, for reliable places to hunt, but also to maximize blueberry yield. You have to burn blueberry crops to be able to create a healthy cycle for the berries to grow. And we know that Wabanaki people did that. So you can see here, unfortunately pixelated on the bottom left, this is actually a lithograph that was done of Mount Desert Island in 1627 of a moose hunt. And so here they're burning parts of the island to chase the game out into the water to be able to hunt, spear, or shoot them from with arrows in the water. And shooting from a canoe was really, really common for Wabanaki people. They were spearing sturgeon from canoes. They were spearing porpoises, and maybe sea mink. And so being able to do moose or deer was also well within the bounds of sort of what they would have experience doing from a birch bark canoe. So in the book, they talk several times about farming, and especially mostly related to Molly Ockett, who lived further south. She was more within the Wabanaki territory than the Penobscots. And so Molly, they mentioned her planting her corn and then leaving. And so that is probably true for most of people within maybe like southern and sort of southeastern portion or western portions of Maine, where there wasn't reliable farming the way that we would think about it now. It was more that they would plant crops in the spring and then leave them and see, if whatever they did, if they came back in the fall, whatever was there, they would harvest it or trade it. But it wasn't that there was somebody tending those farms in the way that we think of farming in the same way. So they were absolutely growing and cultivating, but not farming in the way that we would think about it or define it today. And that was much more common, more in southern Maine than it would have been in this area where the winters were too long and too severe to have that be a reliable source of food worth their time. So MDI at the time of European contact would have had probably between 300 and 400 to 500 inhabitants that were here through various times of the year seasonally. At the time of European contact, and the island was called Pematik, which translated to range of mountains. The leadership of this area was under someone by the name of Astaku. We wouldn't, maybe more like a governor than like a head chief we might think of. They had a lot of different regional communities, and they had leaders within those regional communities that then had relationships with sort of a larger cultural leader that was more centrally located, that all of the different smaller communities responded to. And so Astaku would have been here for this island region, but he was part of and managed a community that was part of a larger alliance or confederacy that extended from about where Kennebunkport is in the Kennebunk River to the Narragansett River. So that was sort of this coastal extent of territory. And central to that territory is Penagoet. And that's where our first Molly shows up at what we now know as Castin, but was known traditionally as Penagoet. And this was the central gathering place for the Confederacy because it was very strategically located between these two rivers that established their boundary, and also at the mouth of the Bagaduce River, where it's entering Penobscot Bay. So it's just a very, very strategic, very important location for Wabanaki people, and also later for Europeans as well. In 1615, it became a site for major fur trading all up and down the coast, which is sort of where we come in to our stories with Molly Mathilde. And for nearly a century, this was contested territory between Wabanaki, French, British, and briefly the Dutch. Wabanaki people in this period of time had over 150 years of exposure to war, disease, and displacement, which equaled the death of about 90% of their population. So just to give some perspective to what these women were facing in this period of time is this unbelievably devastating, not just war, but disease, displacement, and massive loss and cultural upheaval of everything that they knew at the time. And so, as we saw with these women, Wabanaki people collected themselves into safe, remote communities. They assimilated, they attempted to find some sense of balance between a life that was constantly shifting underneath them and with all of these new pressures. And so that's sort of the era where we enter Women of the Dawn, is in this Penagoet era. And we leave it with Molly Dellis in the 1920s and 30s, which on MDI is really where we see this resurgence of Wabanaki people as an encamped, solidified community. Certainly between European contact in the 1840s, Wabanaki people were absolutely still coming to MDI. We have really great early records of early European settlers recording positive, strong relationships with Wabanaki people who were still coming to the island to gather sweetgrass, to be able to hunt, to be able to fish and gather clams and other resources. We have accounts from the late 1700s and early 1800s of Wabanaki people on Somes Sound, the Sound, but also Somes Pond, who were there, and they would go visiting to the people who lived in Somesville. And there's accounts of them meeting up for tea or having cookies on the porch and sharing music and sharing stories and talking, because by this time, the island is settled as an American state, and all that warfare is over a century behind them, and Wabanaki people have found this way of continuing to thrive in these spaces, and they're doing it collectively with their American neighbors. So the hubs of Wabanaki communities settle near where their safe places were. So all the women talk about going up to the islands above the falls, which is where Orono is in the Penobscot River. That's Indian Island. That's their safe place. And so that's still the hub of Penobscot people today. The Abenaki actually fled north into Canada. And so their safe havens are in Odanak. The Micmac and the Maliseet and the Passamaquoddies are further down east. But for where this story takes place, we really ground that up in the Bangor vicinity. And so we see, as I mentioned, sort of the transition that these women are making from day-to-day lives within the cultural context of what they understood to be tradition, to taking those traditions and using them to be able to continue their lives. And so unlike the men who maybe were out negotiating or fur trading or at war or whatever, these women are grounded still within this territory and within this space, and they have to try to make a livelihood for themselves and do everything they can to be able to continue providing for their families. And so they do that within the cultural context of their sphere, which is basket making, medicine, midwives. So it starts by sort of the selling and sharing of traditional knowledge to skills, to basketry, and then later art. So by the 1860s, 1870s, there are encampments of Wabanaki people coming down to MDI to take advantage of the booming tourist industry. By 1880, we've got encampments on the waterfront where they're selling birch bark canoe tours, hunting excursions to catch porpoise or seabirds, or just having a guide to be able to take people around in a birch bark canoe, fortune tellers, baskets of all different types and varieties, musicians, storytellers, and going to the encampment was part of an experience when you came as a visitor to MDI. So the first encampment is along the water down on High Street, and then it eventually gets moved to where the ball field in Bar Harbor is now and is there for a number of years, which is the postcard sort of on the upper right hand side. And then that ends up getting shut down, like 100% for prejudice, but the excuse is an outbreak of cholera or typhoid. I can't remember which they were worried about. Both, we had outbreaks of both on the island, but they were worried about water sanitation and sanitation in the camps spreading disease. And so that was sort of the outward excuse for closing down the encampment. And so then now Wabanaki people again have had to make this cultural transition to how their relationship exists with MDI, which is to live here and to work here and to return here sometimes in the summers for festivals and for events and for different things, as they maintain this as part of the integrity of their more holistic cultural sphere and geographic region. So I'm going to stop there and just check in. How is everybody?
That was great, Rainey.
Yeah, that was fascinating. Yeah. And it's interesting. I had heard, like you said, that there was more year-round activity here than once thought. But you know, just to hear more about it was very, very interesting. And
Good.
yeah, it's great.
Carolyn, do you want to add anything to just that, like 13,000 years in half an hour?
Well, I just want to say I love this book, and I can't believe I never read it. So thank you very much. I read this book all about the last Molly in the book, and so this is a really detailed story of her life, and this was really good. And I ended up, when I read this, I don't know, it was, more than, I don't know, it was 5 or 10. When did it come out?
95.
95. Well, but I didn't read it that early, but I read it when I was living in Maryland. And when I read that she went on these tours, I started trying to find out, where all those places were. And the town that I was living in was a Chautauqua town. And I tried to find out if she ever came there. So I looked through the archives and she didn't. But I did look up the doll that the Smithsonian has of hers. So I found that I even made a page of that and stuck it in the book. So you can find it in the online, catalog records when you look at the Smithsonian. I thought it was a really fascinating way of how she, how Bunny McBride brought this to life, but also how Molly was trying to, research these women in her, own research and her own work. And it just really made me think about her life and how she did it in those days. Certainly oral history, but was she going to archives? How was she doing it, Rainey? Do you have any idea?
She was, yeah. So the scene in the New York Library was,
Yeah.
fiction, but true. Like she went there to do research quite a number of times. And she did in Philadelphia. And then she also did a lot of research. I think she did research in wherever where the Baron, pardon?
Poe.
In France.
Oh, okay. Yeah, in France, in Po.
Yeah.
about Molly Mathilde, and the Baron. And so she went into archives and she was looking for evidence of these women, but because so much of that, oh, and they said she spoke French, Penobscot, and English pretty fluently, all three. And so she was able to get into a lot of these archives and actually be able to read the material. But, you know, at the time, not like nothing's digitized, obviously, and probably even like modern finding aids or, you know, review of what's in the archives and summarized isn't there. And so we think we have a wild goose chase in archives now, but it's like nothing compared to what she would have been up against in 1920 and 1930 to try to find the evidence, slim though it would have been, of what these women's lives were like. But she was trying.
And even, you know, a woman, a Native woman, I mean, archives were not always open to people who were not, you know, PhD scholars. So
Right.
that just amazed me that she was able to do that. So I did remember I'd looked it up when I read Molly Spotted Elk, and I just looked again tonight. You can watch that silent movie online.
Yes, it was re-released by a university or something, I think.
Yeah, and I did look. I wondered if there was a clip of any of her dancing, but I didn't find any. Did you find?
I didn't look for a clip of her dancing. I didn't even think about that. So no, but I don't think she dances in the film. It doesn't.
No,
Yeah,
but I'm just saying in her
life, yeah.
vaudeville era of, and probably not. But anyways, it just
Well, certainly it could have been. I suppose I didn't even think about it.
It could have been, but and more film archives are being found and put online every time I look for something, and then maybe I go back 5 years later and it's there. So, you know, maybe we'll find something someday.
So how do you see the movie?
I think it's just on YouTube. Wait, let me just.
No kidding.
Yeah, I'm sure it's in the public domain at this point.
Yeah.
Called The Silent Enemy. Is that
Yep. Yep. There's like a short little clip of it, and then I think I found the full length. I think I actually watched it a while ago, but yeah, that was an interesting chapter in her life. So
yeah, and I guess she fell in love with the director, and he with her. I can't remember. See, it's hard because I don't remember which is in the book and which is in my research. So
right.
This is for Kathy's benefit, who hasn't read it yet. If it was in the book, I apologize to everyone else. But she finds a note where someone has told him, like, you can't consort with her because she's Native. Yes, she's pretty, but she's Indian, and I can't believe she even sits at the table with us, you know, sort of thing. So she, like, that devastated her in that production and in that experience.
What is, I'm curious about, I mean, I'm sure during all of this time that we're talking about these Mollies, women have not been, they've been seriously repressed. How has the role of women changed within the Wabanaki communities?
So, Wabanaki women would have had, not the same, like, it's different. It was obviously different, and it's hard to, like, explain what it's like, because trying to culturally describe someone else's culture and political structure is like, we use our imperfect words and analogies which just don't translate well.
Right.
I think she does a good job of talking about the fact that in Molly Ockett's life, Molly Molasses' life, the women were not welcome to lend their voice within the political discussion formally, but they're sort of all around the edges, like, you know, just talking and debating and cajoling and influencing. And I think that from the little bit that I know is that's a combination of a little bit being traditional and a little bit being suppressed. So there probably were stronger roles for women prior to European contact, but because Europeans only talk to men,
Yeah.
men were sort of
Yeah.
falsely elevated into this relationship of negotiation and of leadership. So that's partially true, probably, and partially not. But a lot of Native communities where women were influential, again, it's hard to say if this is a reaction to colonialism or not, they were in the behind the scenes influencers.
Yeah.
So it's like, you're gonna go do this and say this because we've decided that
Right.
for you to do.
Mhm.
And I know this book is, I don't know how you put it, but it's based in facts and research, but it's been augmented with fiction just
Yeah.
because you have to
Right.
in this. But I felt like she did a really good job in relaying that in the stories of these women. Clearly, you know, the earlier people were, it was a vastly different time, especially for Native people, with contacts in working through that. But I felt like she was able to convey this sense of strength and autonomy while also doing what needed to be done, which like went beyond, I don't know, I just felt like she did a really, really good job of it. These women who said, you know, I don't want to deal with this crap, I'm going to take my kid and go travel up the river in the winter to get to a safer place up in Quebec. Like, it was like, that's what needed to be done. And it's not like anybody was going to stop her and say, oh, you need to stay here. Again, we don't know the whole story because so much of that information isn't available.
Yeah.
Now, another question I had is, I know some tribes are, do they have written not histories, but is there a something that is created by the tribes that talk about their history? Because it's oral tradition in Passamaquoddy, isn't it, in Penobscot?
Yes. Yeah, out west there are tribes that would do what they call like the winter counts, which are done on like buffalo hide
Right.
robes, and they capture like an important thing that happened on various days throughout the year, and then they're recounted and retold and saved
Right.
and shared. But there's no tradition of that I've heard of here. The only exception that I've heard from indigenous people is that the petroglyphs are
Yeah.
probably some form of marking of an oral tradition, but they've lost what it is.
So most of the resources, Bunny or Molly, the last Molly Dellis,
Yeah.
was drawing upon was research done by white people,
Or the oral traditions told to her from
or
her
the oral
uncles.
traditions told to her. And I know at the Historical Society and with libraries, we talk a lot about primary source information. How does I'm straying a little bit here, but I these subjects like kept roiling around in my brain as I was reading this book. How does I mean, these are just areas that I just feel like are lost. Like, how does the academic community view oral histories? Or
It used to be completely rejected.
oh yeah,
It's just
yeah.
myth. And that's changed probably since the 90s, but more seriously now, where there is a lot of really good evidence that you can extrapolate from oral tradition, that you can corroborate between natural events or natural disasters or landscape markings or things
Right.
like that. And had I not taken the route to do my work in museums, my interest actually was comparing and contrasting archaeological and oral traditions to see like where they can learn from one another. And then I wanted to take that and look at what happens to displaced tribes and their oral traditions, and what happens in tribes that weren't displaced. But I made a museum career, so someone
Yeah.
else will have to do that research. But I think it's fascinating, and I'll just say to speak to Bunny's intent, she talks about it in her methodology and references, where she calls it, I found the term, where she says it's creative nonfiction, because she wrote it as complete nonfiction and then gave it to her husband, who's also an ethnohistorian, to look at it. And he says, this woman does not breathe. Like, you need to breathe life into her. So she decides to do this creative nonfiction. And she says in here, because one of my questions to you guys was to challenge the fact that could a non-native write like this now in this day and age? Would they have sort of permission, or would this seem like overreach? And she writes, like, because she's right at the fore of sort of when this starts to get challenged. She said, clearly it's possible to reach across cultural divides, to communicate with and understand one another, to glean insights from the experiences and perspectives of others. That said, it's important to note that I ventured into the lives of these women with caution and deep respect for their particular ethnic identities, knowing that when one steps out of one's culture and time, what appears to be familiar may not be at all. When I started the book, I was not really any closer to or further away from St. Castin as I was, or with whom I share whiteness, than to Molly Mathilde, with whom I share womanhood. So she's also clearly grappling with that same question, Lisa, of like, is it okay? How does it work? What do I do? And it's interesting to hear that you guys thought it would work, or that it worked. I'd be curious, David and Kathy, like what you guys think too.
Go ahead.
I on that point, I thought she did a good job. I probably would have been more comfortable if she had some sort of native partner that was at least, in the background checking her, or agreeing with her. But I did notice that to me, it seems like the book is anchored on the men, that because that's where the data comes from. That like, I know a lot more about Molly Mathilde than I do, I think, about the number two. We know, except for the fourth one, Molly Nelson. We know from her, but we know a lot more about Molly Mathilde, I think, or at least felt that way, a little bit more alive, because Castin generated all these records about his career. And then it's not about him, but that she can extrapolate Molly Mathilde's history from the key points in Saint Castin's life, and sort of portray her in a reaction to the events that have come to her through him. I don't think that's a flaw in I know exactly what, but I don't think that's a flaw in the book, but it's sort of a necessity. And that the numbers 2 and 3, there isn't really a white guy prominent throughout the story to generate enough documentation so that the men in that are Native Americans. And so you have the tribal councils and everything that are known, but not quite as much. And so I didn't quite, this could be my poor reading of it, but I couldn't quite get as much a picture or emotional picture of those two as I could of number 1 and number 4. But I also just want to thank you for this before, and then when you took over. These presentations are marvelous. These presentations bring the books alive. This one brought the book alive. Last time brought the book alive, and it must be a tremendous amount of work.
It is a lot of work, and I'm grateful to hear that, because Jenna's shoes were really big to fill. So I'm happy that you feel like the quality of the presentation has continued. So
Yes.
Good, thank you. Other observation, or Kathy? Yeah.
Well, no, I mean, like I say, I have not gotten very far yet, but I feel like, she writes very respectfully, and what's the word I'm looking for? Like, objectively, I never got the sense that she was trying to, she's just telling, she's not trying to be part of that story in any way. And this is such a touchy issue nowadays, and I get why. I do understand why. but like I know this friend who's a journalist and was writing about the ash problem
Mhm.
and thought it would have more impact if some of the oral history, you know, like the really old traditional, like creation stories even, that involve the ash were more than just mentioned, you know.
Mhm.
But she really couldn't do it. You know, it wasn't because she's not native. And it was frustrating to her because she felt like it would have made the article better and it would have grabbed people and, you know, gotten the attention that this ash borer needs, you know, if she could have linked it to a more spiritual part of the culture.
Mhm.
So it's a tough thing, but one of you guys mentioned if wishing them, Bunny McBride had sort of a native partner to bounce things off of or kind of give it, you know, an officiality. And I know what you mean. You almost nowadays you almost need that. You really need, um you need a co-author or you need a tribal person to run it by, you know, because this whole appropriation thing, very understandable why it's so touchy now. But I feel like the pendulum swings, you know, and it swung like so extremely far in a horrible, horrible direction for centuries, you know, that, you know, whatever we have to kind of do to get the lumps out and figure out how to proceed from here
Mhm.
is what we have to do. You know, it's just
I will say, just I didn't go into her history because this is an MDI book club, but I can talk a little bit about Bunny. And that is that she doesn't say who, but she mentions that she had two Native women as reviewers, and that she worked extensively with Jean, Molly Dellis's daughter, probably in Molly Spotted Elk, which was published before this book, but so she doesn't specify it was for this book or that one. But Bunny is an anthropologist and ethnohistorian who her husband is also, and together they worked quite extensively with the Micmac community to get federal recognition in the early 1990s. So they've worked with communities in Maine since the 1980s land claim settlement petition and successful court case. They were involved with that, and then they've been involved with Charles Shea, who's a Penobscot military vet and elder whose story they've been working really hard to capture, who actually lives in Molly Dellis's house on Indian Island, and then, like I said, doing all of the work for the Micmac's federal recognition petition, which was successful. And then they've also curated a number of exhibitions at the Abbey Museum. And so they have a high degree of respect among the tribes. And then in 2007, they did the cultural analysis of Wabanaki people for Acadia National Park. So there's this huge document, these two books, you can find them for free online or in any of the libraries, called Astaku's Island Domain. And it's the ethnography of the park from like 1620 to 1970, I think. And so she has very deep, extensive connections with Wabanaki people. And so in that case, I think can be credited with having that support and that backing and that voice. But I don't know if the Wabanaki would feel the same way about an author writing from this perspective now that they did in 1999 when it was first published. Like, if they would want that story to be told in their own voices or not.
Right.
You know, you're making me remember, Rainey, why I didn't read this book initially. Because I remember when it came out and thinking, and for those of you that don't know, I worked for many, many years at the National Museum of the American Indian. And so that's when this book came out. And I said, wait, how can a non-native woman write this because I mean I heard about the book. Now I'm not going to read that. There are so many books by Native women. I want to, read more of those, and so that's why I didn't read it. But Rainey, I just come back to you, and you may not know the answer to this. As I was reading it this time and thinking, wow, she really did. I mean, I like reading the book. I I really couldn't sort out how much of the creative portrayal of the first three Mollys were perhaps part of the diaries of the last Molly, because when you read little clips that she includes of Molly's diary, I mean, she's a really creative writer herself. So that's where I wasn't sure, maybe, and I mean that in a positive way, maybe Molly Dellis was really imagining the life of the first three Mollys, and Bunny used that. I mean, I did read that Molly's daughter, endorsed, supported this.
Yeah.
So anyway, do you know any more?
I don't. I mean, in the references and materials section of the back, she I think that she mentions that like Molly Dellis didn't get super far in her research for all the reasons we've talked about, right? Like the challenge of being in the archives in the 1920s and 30s, the devastation of war, losing her husband, trying to piece together a life for herself, so how did she comes and goes from the connections of those stories. I think what I recall Bunny saying is like it enters in the diaries a little bit more than it enters in like her attempting to draft actual, historical narrative. And those might be more snippets, but I think she does a really good job at the back of explaining her reconstructions, which I thought was really valuable because I was a little nervous about like the liberties taken in personifying another person, not just in this situation, but anybody who tries to like take that modern sensibility and modern voice and modern perspective and personify a historic figure has pros and cons. And so I was definitely like thinking about that, but the fact that she does these reconstruction explanations in the very back of the book, I thought was like a good way of just trying to kind of owning it and just saying like, yep, this is what I tried and this is where I tried it and this is how I did it. And for all that maybe it wouldn't be if you tried it today, it jumped a certain amount of empathy or a certain amount of connectivity at a time when it wasn't possible or it wasn't happening. And so there's credit to that too, right? Like something had to get us to the point where we're like, oh, is that okay? Because nothing was happening before, right? So
Were you, I can't remember, Rainey, were you working at the museum when Bunny did the Indians and Rusticators? Or you guys did it, but you were there, right?
Yeah.
So you worked with her?
Yeah. Yeah. And Harold. Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I haven't seen them
Indians
since. So I
and-
had a little bit of insight with her that. But yeah, that was when in their book Indians in Eden is like the popular
Not this one.
yeah, that one. That is the popular summary of the work they did for the park.
And
So
didn't the Abbey, wasn't their first exhibit in the new museum the three Mollys?
Four Mollys.
Yeah.
I mean, four Mollys, yes.
Yeah, and that predated me. I didn't get to see the Four Mollys, but
And I didn't either because I left right as the
before it.
museum was complete.
Yeah.
So I
So
did
there-
see the exhibit though.
So there was an exhibition of
Yes.
this book?
Yeah, I remember that
essentially?
now that you mention it. Yeah.
Oh.
In 2001, I believe.
So what survives of that? Anything?
I have no idea because when I was at the Abbey, I only knew the name and that it was like one of the opening exhibits, but I never had a chance to see it. And I would imagine there's pictures in the institutional records at the Abbey because opening the downtown was huge.
Yeah.
But I don't know how
Drew
long it
Colbert
stayed up.
might know because I think Drew was
Yeah.
Even
probably
vets were
through
doing the
vets.
exhibits at the time.
Mhm.
Yep. Hmm.
I
Interesting.
think they had her dress.
Yeah.
It was a long time ago, and I was very pregnant, so I
I
don't know.
know.
if I
I'm trying to
remember.
remember because I think I did see it, and yeah. But I think you're right. They had a dress. I don't know which Molly it was, but
I think it was her dress that Molly Dellis danced in.
I think you're right.
I think the Penobscots have it. So it probably was borrowed from them.
Yeah,
Yeah.
probably. So I gotta ask, this isn't really related to the book, but in the picture of the guys in the canoe, is that David
Yep.
Moses Bridges? Yeah. I'll tell you, I met him one time, well, a couple times, but first time I met him. So that same journalist that I mentioned that was struggling with the Ash story and wanted to put the spiritual story in, got a what do you call those? Like a arts endowment prize. I can't remember. There's a name for it. And the tribes are often involved in that with their baskets.
Mhm.
So they had like a banquet for the winners. So I went. She had actually gotten it for creative nonfiction. Speaking of, yeah.
Cool.
Yeah. So anyway, they had this like reception at somebody's house, and he had a lot of his stuff out and include his own work, and then like 3 or 4 albums of photos of his family, and just, oh my gosh. But there was something, I know this sounds really corny, but there was just something about him, like from the moment I met him, I just felt like there was something really super special about that guy, and I'm just sad that he's gone.
Every single
You
person
know?
who's ever met him believes that to be true also. And I'll just say, I spent 6 years with him every summer as an educator, and I watched him tell the exact same explanation to 500 people a day, like 7 times a summer for 6 years straight, and he never ever blew anybody off. Like every single person, is that one piece of bark? Is that what, like, it's
Yeah.
just a basic question, right? That introduces you to like get to talk to him, that as any normal educator, you'd be like, oh yes, it's one piece of bark, or whatever.
Right.
Every time he was just like, yes, it is. And blah, 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 and I complimented him on it once. And he said, yeah, because like, I'm the ambassador for them to, like, I'm the first opportunity they have. And if I am dismissive or I blow them off, I've just lost them. I've shut down. And his sense of like responsibility for education, it's just, like, it is a rare gift.
Yeah.
In
Yeah.
this world. And
So
he is
open-hearted.
a loss,
Yeah.
for sure.
Another time I saw him, he was actually teaching at Beechcliff, and he told like an age appropriate version of some of the colonial stuff, and like the Battle of Norwalk,
Mm.
which one of my ancestors was on the other side.
Mm.
And later I said, hey, I think one of my ancestors killed some of your ancestors, and he was extremely gracious, so gracious. Just realizing that is our history.
Mm-hmm.
That is our history. And we can never, how do I say this? We can never go backwards and undo what is done, but to move forward, that guy, like you say, he was so respectful and not dismissive, and just like open-hearted, so open-hearted. I'll tell you what.
Yeah, I think he's the best educator I've ever seen.
Yeah. And and they don't make them too many like him, I guess, right? Yeah.
No. All right, so thank you for taking a minute to talk about David, because I was like, talked about David even though he's not a Molly. So
I know it's a little off topic, but
That's okay.
It all ties together.
Yeah. So we're gonna have a little holiday break and probably regroup in February, and I'll come up with some maybe a little lighthearted. We talked about maybe working with Robin and Bob's book, even though maybe not everyone, like she's on our board, and so they may be able to come and talk a little bit, and we can do some history because it's like a historic fiction of a murder mystery. It'd be fun. Have the author join us, that'd be fun.
Oh, okay, yeah. I was trying to remember which one was that because you had a big good list.
I did have a good list going, and I didn't have that one on the list, so it'll be a new one. The book is I'm editing Chewbacca articles right now. My brain is like,
Yeah, that's okay.
I can't remember offhand. It's something about like, no, it's not The Wall, because that's the Mary Roberts Reinhardt book we wrote, but it's in that same genre and that same vein of like fun, locally based murder mystery, and they're inspired by Mary Roberts Reinhardt. So Murder with an Ocean View. Got it. I won. Winner. And it's a writing couple, Bob and Robin Lawton, but they go by Rob Lawton is their pen name. So I know they sell it at Sawyer's, and I know they've got it at the bookstore, or the bookstores, the library, and I know it's available on Kindle. So, but I'll send out an announcement and a date for that in probably late February. Any last thoughts, comments, or observations? We didn't have a huge amount of discussion on this one, but
I guess I better finish the book.
yeah. Awesome. Well, I'm grateful for you guys to come out tonight. I know it was a smaller group, but that's okay. It was just nice to see everybody, and I love talking about books.
Thank you so much, Rainey. This is
Thank
really
you guys. Take care. Have
Thank
a
you,
good
Rainey.
holiday season.
Bye, everyone.
Good night.
Bye.
Night.